First, I want to say hello to everybody and thank you, Joe, and the Center for Mark Twain Studies for inviting me to give this talk today. I also like to take a minute to thank Steve Webb for his hospitality at Corey Farm, and also Matt Siebold. I'm not sure if he's here today, but for speaking with me about what I'm going to present today for you all. Okay, so the project that I'm going to share with you really grew out of my research on the legacy of Washington Irving. So do we have any Van Winkle, right? So when Irving published the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, that was in 1819 and 1820. This was a semi-autobiographical travel narrative, most famous for including the short stories, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. What he was doing with that is he was concerned with defining the literature, culture, and national identity of the new world against the old. In various of Irving's works, he has his persona narrator, Geoffrey Crayon is his name, traveling throughout Europe, visiting ruins, monuments, and mausoleums in order to discover the young nation's character. He did so in order to help an early America, still in its cultural infancy, to define, in Crayon's words, the gigantic race from which the nation was degenerated. Irving was using the terms facetiously to respond to those who claimed that U.S. authors were merely poachers, second-rate imitators capable only of recycling the superior styles and materials of its cultural ancestors, like Shakespeare, for example. Interestingly, in one of the best-known chapters from Irving's sketchbook, where the narrator visits the birthplace and grave of Shakespeare, he recounts the story of how the young bard got caught poaching deer on an ancestral estate. He attributes the poet's early genius to this act of stealing. In looking at the legacy of Irving then, I hoped to show that in the aftermath of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction, U.S. authors were similarly attempting to define the new, in this case the New South, against the old, using familiar genres, such as the sketch and travel narrative. I wanted to pay special attention to the ways in which poaching, imitation, and textual appropriation influenced Twain's life on the Mississippi, his story, Life on the Mississippi. As scholars like William W. Stowe have observed, U.S. travel writers in the 19th century were eager to explore themes like cultural refinement, class mobility, race, gender, foreign influence, and democracy. These notions that Irving first explored in his sketchbook proved to be enduring models of literary citizenship that subsequent authors like Twain engaged with in order to compare their own present moment with the relics of the past. A legitimate question to ask then is why focus on Life on the Mississippi rather than Twain's other travel narratives? This is an especially important question given the fact that Twain directly addresses many of the issues I mention here today in The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress, and A Tramp Abroad. My focus on Life on the Mississippi highlights the ways in which Twain used his own experiences as a passenger and a pilot to effectively redefine what national literature meant in the extended aftermath of emancipation and the Civil War. I use Irving's sketchbook as a kind of starting point or an anchor text because it shows how early US literature's preoccupations with the ruins, relics, and monuments of the Old World, again, provided a useful framework for reconceptualizing post-Reconstruction expressions of new Southern literary identities. Irving's influences on Twain are seen in many ways, from the sleepy town of Hannibal, Missouri, to slumbering steamboats, to towns which, to quote Twain, sprung up in the night while he slept. Twain was also an avid reader of Irving, particularly Rip Van Winkle, a story in which a man slumbers through a war and wakes to find a nation radically different than the one that he remembers, but also in other ways uncannily similar. Twain would also wake from the war in a sense, to find the river and the South that he remembered radically different, but also uncannily similar. Like I said, when readers think about the most memorable parts of his book, Life on the Mississippi, they tend to think of Twain's picturesque descriptions of the slumbering inhabitants of Hannibal, Missouri, or Twain as an apprentice pilot learning to read the river like a book, or the father-son dynamic between Twain and his mentor, Horace Bixby. These memorable scenes all first appeared not in Life on the Mississippi, but in another text called Old Times on the Mississippi, an arguably more polished, structurally coherent text published serially in the Atlantic Monthly in 1875, about 7 or 8 years before Life on the Mississippi. While those sections are certainly crucial to understanding Twain's narrative, in which readers follow the author's journey as a useful apprentice through to his maturity as an experienced pilot, I'm more interested in exploring the entirety of Life on the Mississippi as a kind of sketchbook that tracks Twain's evolving attitudes towards the social, economic, and geographic changes that the South underwent throughout the extended aftermath of the Civil War. On returning to the river in 1882 to research for his book, this time he returned as a passenger and not as a pilot. And in doing so, Twain finds himself, quote, mixed in with society in ways that he perhaps might never have imagined. This, I believe, is reflected in the sketch-like aesthetic that Twain cultivates throughout Life on the Mississippi. Profoundly influenced by the traditions and expectations of Anglo-European travel writing, this mode of writing takes new shape in Twain's narrative, as the ruins and relics that are supposed to mark the people and places of the South exist not in some external object like like Shakespeare's grave, but only in Twain's memory, which is, like the river, constantly shifting. For a pilot out of practice, this devastation can be difficult to navigate, even for him. A significant difference that I see in Twain's Life on the Mississippi is that unlike Irving's narrator, Geoffrey Cran, who believes that mausoleums housed recoverable artifacts capable of measuring American character against a superior race of Europeans, the ruins of the New South for Twain are often only ever recoverable in memory. Twain's steamboat pilot, for example, navigates the changing waters of the Mississippi River by committing its, quote, heavy shadows and grisly gray mists to memory, only later to be quietly devastated by the ruins, relics, and reshapings of the American South. Any attempt to preserve a so-called original or essential recollection of the events, either through monuments or texts, ultimately fail because these people and places cannot be revisited. In many cases, the people and places of Twain's past are either maimed, killed, or completely destroyed by Mississippi floodwaters or exploding boilers. In other contexts, the land itself becomes unrecognizable due to ever-encroaching industrialization and federal attempts to, quote unquote, control the river and in turn the author's memory of it. What I am trying to gesture toward here is that Life on the Mississippi could never be a so-called authentic portrait of Samuel Langhorne Clemens or the South he seeks to represent. Rather, it is in keeping with Irving's tradition, it is a sometimes factual, frequently fictional narrative of the persona of Twain and the environs that mark it. In this sense, I would like to suggest that memory itself becomes a kind of vernacular expression of the self, a local dialect in which the self becomes a sketch-like patchwork of texts, identities, histories, and geographic locations. In considering the relationship between language and memory, then, Twain's South represents a vernacularized expression of the South. As a result, the life that he describes is not so much a memoir of an historical person as it is an autobiographical narrative of a persona. However readers proceed in identifying Life on the Mississippi as a text which contains autobiographical elements, it is crucial to acknowledge the ways in which the text expands traditional notions of the self to include people, places, histories, and texts, and indeed whole ways of life that exceed the limits of individual selfhood. Unlike an author like William Wells Brown, who emphasizes possession in his 1880 memoir, My Southern Home, Twain turns away from that kind of ownership. It is life on the Mississippi, not my life on the Mississippi, an intentional omission that I think obscures the author's own role in the life he claims to have lived, in a sense. And it further highlights Twain's lifelong struggles with the realities of ownership, possession, and even authorship. In my view, Twain is caught between the pilot of his past and the passenger of the present, a crisis of identity that is further complicated by the many detours of race and indigeneity that he takes along the way. Ultimately, his place both in the world and in the text is, like the Mississippi River itself, subject to competing forces that move between freedom and constraint, fact and fiction. One of the issues Twain has with so-called foreign passengers writing on the Mississippi is that they merely imitate one another and fail to acknowledge the changes that the river affects. However, there are times when Twain himself even catches himself writing and speaking like these tourists. In commenting on this very issue, the scholar Leo Marx once famously said that, quote, "Passengers are strangers to the river," and we see in Life on the Mississippi, Twain also becoming a kind of stranger to the South he once knew and committed to memory. When revisiting the places of his youth, Twain discovers that the once decipherable river text of the author's own life is again unrecognizable. Like Rip Van Winkle, time unsettles Twain's narrator, and this is felt most intimately in the recollection of his mentor, Horace Bixby, who has not changed a bit in the decades since Twain last saw him. Or you can see it in the steamboats, which have become decayed and worn out. And he finds it increasingly more difficult to discriminate between reality and the memories which seem like mere imitation. Twain engages most provocatively with this paradox of memory as both fixed and fluid with another crucial male figure in his life, Isaiah Sellers. The image of Sellers' monument recalls Twain's own conflicted feelings about literary poaching, imitation, and appropriation. The story, as Twain tells it, at least, was that Sellers was known for composing, quote, brief paragraphs of plain, practical information about the river. Twain would then burlesque these in print, and Sellers became deeply offended, and he no longer signed these brief paragraphs with the name Mark Twain. As a result, Clemens, in his words, confiscated the name, or you might say poached it, and it would become, the author hoped, a sign and symbol of petrified truth. But even in memorializing Sellers and remembering the so-called origins of his own pseudonym, Twain values monuments not so much as relics in and of themselves, so much as what they reveal symbolically about pilots. Twain depicts Sellers in romantic terms that align more with his boyhood ambitions than those of a seasoned pilot decades into retirement. The tension between the image of Sellers as both monumentalized myth and immolated martyr reveals a great deal about how poaching, in this case a name, paradoxically transforms the author himself into a kind of living relic. Much earlier in Life on the Mississippi, for example, Twain anticipates some of these concerns in the chapter immediately following the death of his brother. After describing the horrible view of Henry's cooked flesh, Twain reveals that in the years after this event, he became a scribbler of books, and this is the important part I want to emphasize, an immovable fixture among the other rocks of New England. The chiseling of an identity through years of travel, Journalism, lecturing, and writing are disposed of in this moment in order to give space to the present. Let us resume now, he says, forgetting all of those other accomplishments that he did. Now, when Twain is but a passenger recollecting a past that looks nothing like the days when he was a pilot. Of course, the now of Twain's world is, as James Dobson has observed, a world in which, quote, the past and present are not so much divided as side by side. Twain would make similar claims in his autobiography, but it is in this transitional chapter where Twain attempts to disentangle Henry's horrific accident with the realities of authorship that made him a monumental literary figure. To be a, quote, sign and symbol also signified the ways in which Mark Twain becomes intelligible both as a literary figure and as something that figures like a metaphor. This is best illustrated when the author himself becomes a kind of monument. After witnessing what Twain called the desolation of the South, he observes a steamboat, just one and no more, which is dedicated to Mark Twain. The boat itself is found lying at rest in the shade, and although Twain seems somewhat flattered, maybe even a little embarrassed by it, the boat also serves as a reminder of the ways in which the South is always, in a sense, borrowed, poached, appropriated, and commercialized. For Twain, it is a spectacle ultimately best observed through the distant lens of a spyglass, rather than through the windows of a pilot house, which is no longer available to him. As the steamer named after Twain suggests, it is an appropriated sign and symbol that can be taken by others without permission, a fact Twain knew all too well given his lifelong struggles with securing intellectual property, fighting copyright infringement, and challenging trademark violation. It's not long before Twain is once again confronted with what remained of the South as he once knew it, though. And the author reflects more and more on the defects of memory and the ways in which observation failed to align with recollection. Following a number of events, such as industrialization, the Civil War, and the development of railroads, Twain comes to realize that steamboats and pilots were, quote, things of the dead and pathetic past. This makes Twain's earlier observation that the steamer bearing his name was merely lying at rest a little bit more ominous. Given the picture he paints elsewhere, the boat may as well have been dead. It is as if Twain, like Irving's Rip before him, had awoken to this unsettling reality. On returning to St. Louis, Twain remarks that the metropolitan center is itself prosperous and advancing, but that the river edge of it seems dead past resurrection. Again, recalling Rip, Twain recollects half a dozen sound-asleep steamboats, where I used to see a solid mile of wide-awake ones. In this new world, the pilot was no longer, in Twain's words, a king without a keeper, but he had been absorbed into the common herd. Twain finds himself, not unlike what he calls the water's mulatto complexion, mixed in with his surroundings, an identification with black life first begun following Twain's violent resistance to his so-called master's oppressive treatment of he and his brother, Henry. In order to protect Henry from William Brown, who in his fury attacks him with a 10-pound lump of coal, Twain intervenes by hitting Brown with a good, honest blow and then insulting the man's grammar. After the exchange with Brown aboard the Pennsylvania, Twain recalls, "I knew how an emancipated slave feels, for I was an emancipated slave myself." This is an important episode that illustrates the ways in which the author's own identity is becoming profoundly unsettled and destabilized in the retelling of events. What is perhaps most significant about the reconstructed Twain, to use Joe Fulton's description of the author at this time, and what marks life on the Mississippi as a text concerned with the racial implications of the river's mulatto complexion, is Twain's continued rhetorical strategy of identifying Southern political priorities using antebellum language and iconography. In numerous speeches, for example, Twain describes voters as chattels and slaves to political parties. Meanwhile, he taunts presidential candidates with freedom papers that emancipated him from obeying the party line. Here, it becomes evident that the water's mulatto complexion certainly signaled the ways in which Twain's identity became mixed as a result of historical and sociological change. But it also represents an attempt to navigate the muddy political waters of Reconstruction. Indeed, the advice of Twain's mentor, Horace Bixby, to, quote, steer by the shape that's in your head, not only no longer applies, but is actively dangerous given the radical changes endured by the river, nation, and even Twain himself. Memory of what once was can no longer be trusted, and perhaps, in anticipation of Huck's time with Jim on the Mississippi, now was a time to unlearn what he thought he knew. In an attempt to deflect the seriousness of his perceived loss of home, Twain humorously describes the boat that he intended to revisit old settlements. Quote, she was a venerable rack heap and a fraud to boot, for she was playing herself for personal property, whereas the good, honest dirt was so thickly caked all over her that she was righteously taxable as real estate. Importantly, Twain in this episode also observes that a, quote, colored boy was on watch here, nobody else visible. From him, Twain learns that the boat, quote, ain't unloaded yet, and so determines that we had to give up the novelty of sailing down the river on a farm. As Lee Sandlin notes, farm life, especially after the war's end, did not guarantee either stability or wealth. In fact, riverbanks were often occupied by squatters and homeless veterans who, in Sandlin's words, found themselves unable to fit in back at home or anywhere else. For Twain, however, the life of a so-called pilot farmer went beyond mere dispossession and instead signaled the ways in which black and white, slave and free, intermixed. Twain's repeated use of antebellum language to explain white dispossession tends to collapse distinctions between farm and plantation, such that occupational markers of black and white labor become once again mixed in this New South. But, as is important to remember, Twain is still a passenger and a tourist here, and is ultimately able to escape these conditions. Still, this is a crucial episode in Twain's midlife navigation of the river, insofar as he becomes more and more concerned with exploring semantically, geographically, and temporally fluid boundaries of racial identification. The Mississippi is, as Thomas Ruiz Smith writes, an intensely intertextual space, and Twain recognizes as much when he writes that the river, quote, plays havoc with boundary lines. In fact, the persona of Mark Twain, I would argue, becomes itself an intensely intertextual space, shaped by the lives, stories, and legacies of African and Native peoples. On Twain's upriver journey to Chicago at the end of his life on the Mississippi, for instance, he remarks that some of these regions are, quote, rich in Indian history and traditions. He also challenges an old gentleman, passenger, for telling tales meant to, quote, make a body's mouth water. For Twain, there's nothing worse than that. Readers eventually learn, after much picturesque language, storytelling, and imagery, that the passenger was actually a lecturer for a traveling panorama and in charge of gathering materials for a tourist's guide. It is all, quote, poor stuff, exceedingly sorry rubbish. Nevertheless, during these parts of the book, Twain finds a kind of kinship in what he calls the melted histories of indigenous voices. In these chapters, the gradual disappearance of the steamboat pilot parallels the vanishing presence of indigenous life along the Mississippi, native traces only recuperable in the overly sentimental panorama-like embellishments of a tour guide's romantic poetry and prose. Race and indigeneity are then crucial components of Twain's carefully crafted narrative and nautical persona. By the end of Life on the Mississippi, readers are justified in asking whether or not Twain himself is in full command of the many issues of race, class, ethnicity, and indigeneity that comprise his life on the Mississippi. Even the 1883 edition of Twain's book includes a cover image that creates ambiguity as to whose life readers are meant to consider. Twain himself occupies the spine of the book, which should recall popular depictions of the Mississippi as the spine or central artery of the nation. Importantly, the image is of a young Twain at the pilot wheel. This is the old times on the Mississippi Twain. His return to the Mississippi in 1882 reveals an author grappling more intentionally with the nation's recent and historical legacies of slavery, colonialism, and imperial expansion, which I've only briefly alluded to here today. There are many more examples that I will not get to. The front cover, on the other hand, of Life on the Mississippi depicts what Beverly David and Ray Saperstein describe as an idle rustabout wistfully smoking a pipe atop a cotton bale, a dock worker whose stooped shoulders and weariness attest to years of physical labor rather than indolence. Interestingly, neither writer comments on the race of the worker, and I bring it up here because a similar image appears to accompany the chapter in which Twain compares the steamboat with a farm. Careful examination reveals remarkable similarities between John Harley's image and the cover, for which he, as the book's principal illustrator, is also credited. Similar profiles and attire suggest that the life Twain presents to readers is, like the Mississippi itself, ever-changing and continuously resistant to control. The spinal Twain, a youthful cub pilot literally, figuratively, and bibliographically in the middle of his apprenticeship, is tasked with guiding readers through the unchanging sameness of the back cover's muddy bank. You just have to imagine the back of the book is just a brown cover, and the front cover's suggestion of the nation's ever-changing identity. In the aftermath of the Civil War, emancipation, and Reconstruction, Twain is only able to return to the South as a passenger, a knowledgeable tourist, but a tourist nonetheless, dependent on the plans and pre-planned packets of other men. However, some of Twain's most memorable and revealing observations come when he is a passenger, and the insights he provides would seem impossible without the knowledge and experience he brings as a former pilot. As a final example of what I'm talking about, I invite you to consider Twain's descriptions in Roughing It of what he calls a simple rivulet. He writes of a spring with two outlets traveling in opposite directions, one to the Gulf of California and the Pacific Ocean, and the other to the east, where it joins with the Mississippi before, quote, entering into its rest upon the bosom of the tropic sea, never to look upon its snow peaks again or regret them. Twain seems to be suggesting that even the nation's most remote, isolated, landlocked regions are inextricably connected to one another. From the Sandwich Islands of the South Pacific to the river edge settlements of St. Louis and Hannibal, Missouri, Twain acknowledges the whole by virtue of its opposing directions. Importantly, the so-called New South that I see emerging in many of Twain's travel narratives is actually much more global in scope than is often imagined. And the river, though geographically local for us, is actually a crucial point of connection with the rest of the world. Published in the extended aftermath of emancipation and the Civil War, perhaps this parting stream is an apt metaphor for the nation itself, divergent currents of social, political, cultural, and economic life, ultimately unified despite opposing directions. However, This national and global expansiveness is not without its limitations, and Twain's own desire to be a part of it is not altogether clear. After reflecting on the simple rivulet, Twain concludes by stating, "I freighted a leaf with a mental message for the friends at home and dropped it in the stream. But I put no stamp on it, and it was held for postage somewhere." Despite the technical possibility of remaining connected to home, Twain seems content not to provide the necessary identifying information that would guarantee his message arrived at its intended destination. I won't get into it now, but in his autobiography and in letters to William Dean Howells, Twain is attempting to devise a way of finally expressing his quote-unquote authentic self, and it consists of writing letters to friends and then never sending them. He says only then can he finally be free, if it ever works out like he hoped it would. Unlike Irving's Crayon, or even Melville's Bartleby for that matter, Twain does not seem overly tormented by the failure of communication or the ambiguities of identity and authorship. Indeed, to have one's message be, quote, held for postage could mean ending up in the dead letter office, a fate that Twain seems all too willing to accept, and which becomes doubly ironic given the fact that for much of Roughing It, Twain travels in a stagecoach packed with delayed mail. Of course, Twain's simple rivulet foreshadows his own trans-Pacific voyage in Roughing It, and it anticipates a tropic sea that is far from a place of rest, but rather characterized in part by colonial violence, ecological catastrophe, and imperial ambition, which often has violent outcomes. Toward the end of Roughing It, for instance, Twain describes the monument of the European explorer Captain James Cook. The monument itself, which contained the inscriptions of military visitors, was nothing more than a coconut stump, commemorating the so-called discovery of the island in 1778. Twain does recall another sight, though. He says, "Up on the mountainside, we had passed by a large enclosure like an ample hog pen, built of lava blocks, which marks the spot where Cook's flesh was stripped from his bones and burned." Twain satirizes here depictions of cannibalism and native resistance to colonial occupation by highlighting an image of the founder roasting, details of flayed and burned skin further dramatizing the idea that territorial expansion necessitates a figural, and in this case literal, stripping of the self. Just as he did with Isaiah Sellers, though, Twain is also playing with names here, the roasting body of a monumental figure invoking the fate of one cooked by his own prey. However, the passage loses some of its playfulness when readers consider that Twain, following the horrific explosion aboard the Pennsylvania, will also describe his brother's flesh as cooked. Ironically, the thing that lasts here is the native enclosure itself, and not the guide board which, quote, "the sun and the wind have long ago so defaced it as to render it illegible." Twain seems to be suggesting here that the commemorative aesthetics of Anglo-European colonizers becomes unreadable to future tourists. At the end of the chapter, Twain's own language reverts back to the picturesque. Writing now as one of the quote-unquote innocents, recalling some of his earlier travel narratives, one of the innocents who escapes the fate of the cooks of the world, Twain is able to reflect on the fine breeze and the moon beaming tranquilly down on land and sea. Like a leaf at rest, Twain finds himself, quote, "stretched upon the deck, sleeping the refreshing sleep and dreaming the happy dreams that are only vouchsafed to the weary and the innocent." Readers are left to wonder, or wander, the effects of colonial violence and resistance when the innocent tourist can just leave. But perhaps that is precisely the point of texts like Roughing It and Life on the Mississippi, to rediscover and make legible monuments and memorials of a national past that have become defaced. In closing, the argument I'm trying to make is that the simple rivulet makes this critique of imperialism possible. And ultimately, what I hope to suggest is that Mark Twain be read in the parting streams of America's post-war literary consciousness, the various outlets of authorial expression communicating the author's mental messages, from the simplest rivulet to the largest ocean. The parting streams that connect east and west, north and south, are inseparable from the parting streams of time, the past and present representing two outlets on which the many leaves of Twain's life float. So where does this leave us in relation to how Twain feels about poaching, imitation, and borrowing as a way of defining the national or Southern character of the United States? Toward the end of his life, his actual life, Twain explored the idea that the only thing human beings are capable of is imitation. In his book, What is Man?, Twain reveals a deterministic view of human nature and free will, writing that all thoughts and actions are automatic responses to some outside or external stimuli. The only law governing human action or inaction is, in Twain's words, to secure peace of mind for yourself. For Twain, even William Shakespeare, whom Irving's narrator idolizes in the sketchbook, is no different. We are all, Twain insists, more or less machines dependent on outside influences and training. In fact, in the first line of dialogue of that book, the character of the old man describes the human body as what else but a steam engine. The old man's logic is that while God may have engineered the machine, he left it to man to figure out what to do with it, how to operate it, where to take it. To me, Twain's theories of human nature suggest a model in which the parted streams of invention and imitation occupy the same outlets of expression. However, it also seems like Twain's quote-unquote authentic self, which he can only express through unsent letters, is an attempt to free himself of the machinery of life. The decision to write but not send the letter, or to hold postage, as it were, signals a refusal to let the self be determined by outside influence. That said, this freedom from restraint also implies a different kind of social death, or, as Twain might have said in Life on the Mississippi, enslavement. Thank you.